So I want to talk about two strands in the first 2 decades of the 20th century: women's place, looking at sort of where women are in reality, but also what women are trying to do through different types of reformers. And as you'll see very quickly, they are not trying to do the same thing all the time. Then you'll see the reason to switch to the 1920s is because there's a real sort of break with the amendment giving women to vote. And then I want to talk a little bit about the role of women, the place of women in the Depression, but also as war is beginning to come and we begin to see changes brought in as a result of mass mobilization during the Second World War. So just to sort of set an overview, in 1900, whoops, that went too fast. In 1900, 5.6% of women were employed outside the house. By 1910, it had risen to 10%, nearly 11, and by 1930, nearly 12. However, and this is really important, in 1900, 25% of Black women were employed outside the house. So you can figure that actually means that if you're talking about white women, those numbers in the first line are actually lower. And this is an important thing. Black women's experience in the first half of the 20th century is different from the experience of white women. So if you look at all single women who are working, this is all coming from the census data. Of the single women working, 43% are Black, 25% are immigrant, and only 15% are native white. So the experience of these groups of women differs quite dramatically. In 1905, we know that 8% of divorces marriages ended in divorce, and that women normally initiated these divorces. Though, again, this varies. There is not the same experience in the rural West as opposed to, say, the urban East, or you might also say the urban Pacific West Coast. So let's start with 1914 and the first Mother's Day. You might say, well, this is a day dedicated to motherhood. And that's interesting because this is a really popular thing to do, to establish Mother's Day. And yet it is a really interesting insight into the sort of role of women. But you see, there is a dispute. So people like Carrie Chapman Katz are saying things like, it can't be easy being the husband of a modern woman. She is everything his mother wasn't and nothing she was. So there is change. But in the midst of this change, there's some real traditional values about the role of women. Carrie Chapman Katz, her picture's there. She's the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and suffrage becomes sort of the central focus of what's going on. She was considered quite progressive and radical in that she made her husband sign a prenuptial agreement, giving her 3 months free from the duties of marriage. And you might say, well, what does she mean by that? She doesn't mean cleaning the house. But the reality is that in 1900, most women, the majority of women of really any race, lived in rural environments. These were areas where work was hard, where people were isolated, where there wasn't much in the way of entertainment. And indeed, entertainment and socializing tended to take place around religion. And it's important, no matter what I'm about to say that follows, to bear this in mind, that I'm not talking about the experience of the majority of women who are in these rural environments. Now, there is rural radicalism, but it is of a very, very different variety than urban women's radicalism. Rural radicalism is temperance, going into saloons with axes and breaking up the bars. Now, this form of radicalism is actually lampooned by the elite in the East Coast, and that would be the elite, both male and female, think that this kind of female radicalism is a bit bizarre. In the urban environments, the experience of women tends to revolve around, for the most part, things like boarding. So in Homestead, Pennsylvania, still at 40% of families housed at least one paying boarder. Now that's probably not what we think about. If you're watching things like The Gilded Age and stuff like that, you probably have a very interesting idea of what life is like. In actual fact, life is a lot rougher in these urban environments and much more densely packed. And many of these boarders are immigrants. And during this period, that's largely from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So Slavic, Eastern European, Jewish in particular, fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire, Italians, and they are largely concentrated in garment making in urban areas. Now, there had been Chinese immigration in the 19th century, but it has stopped by law in 1882. And by 1907, there's serious curtailment of Japanese immigration. So what is life in the cities like? Well, it's harsh, it's unsanitary. There are extremely long hours of work and low pay for women. 30% of Chicago department store saleswomen in 1910 were on subsistence wage. So, we talk about today about people in work needing benefits because it isn't enough. This is the reality in this period as well. And in particular, saleswomen, shop assistants, usually were forbidden to sit down while at work, quite often while doing 16-hour days. And this becomes a sort of rallying cry. But what really does have an impact are the unsafe work environments. And the best example of this is the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in 1911. 500 people packed into a sweatshop, and the emergency exits, which there were emergency exits, had been locked from the outside to stop women from taking breaks. And when it caught fire, the result was 146 employees burned to death. Most of the women who survived had to do so by fleeing out of upper windows. So the experience of a rural woman is very much centralized around religion, very concerned about the ill effects of alcohol in the community. The role of the immigrant woman and the working class white woman is very much around these very hard conditions and unsafe conditions in the workplace. The experience of Black American women is much worse. So in the segregated South, Black women are not allowed to use or be referred to as Miss or Mrs. Raping a Black woman was less harshly punished, and we talk now about unisex facilities and be concerned about that. This was the norm. So when you saw colored bathrooms, these were not colored men and colored women. There were male and female white toilets, but Black women were expected to use the same toilet facilities as Black men. So yeah, it's very difficult. But because of segregation, there were certain opportunities for Black women that were not open to white women. So in 1910, 3% of Black lawyers were women. Compare that to whites, 0.5%. 13% of Black doctors were women. Compare that to 6%. And partially, that's because they are barred from clerical and shop assistant roles. So in other words, they are able to get into these other professions, but in a sense are forced to look for other employment opportunities beyond the most obvious one, which is domestic work. Now, it's not surprising that in the urban environment, many of working class whites and working class immigrant whites band together into trade unions. So one of the biggest ones, in fact, the third largest union in the American Federation of Labor, is the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which is huge, and yet it represents only 6% of garment workers, but it is able to carry out some significant strikes. So you see, I think obviously 1911 is the most obvious one. 80,000 garment workers, female garment workers, marching up Fifth Avenue to protest unsafe conditions in the sweatshops. And you see this dovetails with the fire and the experience there. It obviously sparked an enormous response. So white women in working class environments, whether they're immigrant or native born, are very unionized. Most of these unions are closed to Black women. Indeed, most of the jobs are not available to them either. So you do have a lot of different groups, but these groups of women have different kind of goals and different approaches. So the industrial workers of the world, often called the Wobblies, are communist, anarchist. Quite often the Women's National Committees are socialist. The Consumers League is a very middle class, sort of do-gooder type of league. So they lead a boycott against department stores to insist that they allow shop assistants to sit down when they're at work, when they're not actually dealing with a customer. When they're dealing with a customer, obviously the middle class Consumers League expects them to stand up. And the Women's Trade Union League, which focuses on the education of women. So they are aiming at different things. All of them are obviously aiming for their slice of the American dream. But what does that mean? It means largely that their sons are going to be lawyers and doctors, and their daughters are going to be secretaries, nurses, or wives and mothers. But there is some progress. And where you see the most progress is access into clerical work. Now, clerical work in the 19th century is clerking. It is a skilled profession because it involves using pens and stuff like that. And it is male dominated. This begins to change in the 20th century with the introduction of the typewriter. So in 1900, in the census, most women were domestics, farm laborers, or unskilled factory workers. By 1910, you begin to see this new profession, typists and stenographers. And you can see how this grows. By 1930 census, 19% of women are doing this, who are working are doing this. By 1940, it's the largest single category of work that a woman does. But there are other types of occupations as well, and we mustn't forget that. Muncie, Illinois is a great example. Muncie, Illinois is considered Central America, the sort of, if you're going to slice America, you're going to see something that looks like Muncie, Illinois. In 1890s, there were 11,000 people in Muncie, Illinois, and there were 20 to 25 brothels and 80 to 200 prostitutes. So there is other work. The problem is, of course, this is a target of reformers, and it's a target of two types of reformers: conservative, particularly religious conservatives, and feminists are trying to stop this. What they're trying to do is stop licensing schemes, because in the 19th century, many cities licensed brothels, not just Nevada, which still has legal brothels. So they're trying to stop this. But of course, what they're running into is what is historically called seasonal or semi-prostitution, which is that women who are sort of on subsistence level at various points of the year, at various points of time, may resort to prostitution to make ends meet. So we mustn't forget that we can't leave this sort of group out and this sort of experience that women have. Now, what is the real issue in this period? There is one overarching issue that women talk about, and that is the issue of the vote. Now, there are two paths understood. There are women and men pushing for a federal amendment to the Constitution, which would guarantee the vote to all women all across the country. Others are pushing, quite often at the same time, for enfranchisement in the various states. And we see that by 1914, 10 of the 48 states, so almost a quarter, had already enfranchised women. But this produces a backlash. At the same time that garment workers are marching down Fifth Avenue because of the shirtwaist fire, the National Association opposed to the further extension of suffrage to women is being established, and it has money behind it. It has money from the liquor industry because they think that if you let women vote, you're going to be letting a lot of temperance supporters vote. The urban political bosses who think, I've seen those 80,000 women marching down Fifth Avenue and they are socialists. We don't want them getting power. And of course, the Catholic Church is fundamentally opposed to giving the women the vote, which it sees as undermining the traditional role of women in society and the home. So you get a quite virulent anti-suffrage campaign. People say, but women who are pregnant if they get in the line to vote will miss. will miscarry. You will have women who are breastfeeding, their milk will dry up, and that they will be raped at polling stations. A very interesting idea that the solution to men raping women is not stopping men from raping women, it's to stop women from voting. It is fair to say that the suffrage campaign is also kind of naive. So Anna Howard Shaw is a great example of this. She's a proponent of human and equal and natural rights, but why? She says women will protect the home and nation. They will vote for peace, reform, and integrity. Women are the caring, civilizing force. So there is an argument, it's a loud argument, made at the time that the reason you give women the vote is because wars will stop, because women will not vote to send their sons, their brothers, and their husbands and fathers off to war. That's an interesting argument. But the reality is that the women's movement doesn't exist. There are a whole host of women's movements, and they all have different goals. There's temperance, there's trade unionism, there's ones that are based on religion, there's a Zionist movement, there's ones based on race. Even the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is an incredibly conservative organization, is speaking for women. They're all speaking for women, but they're all speaking for specific types of women, and not all speaking about the same thing. Some of these organizations are opposed to suffrage, for example. So if you look at what women are arguing for, what women are protesting about, what women are trying to accomplish, it's a whole range of things. Everything from pure food to prohibition to child labor laws. There is no single women's movement. And to the extent that there is an issue, it is suffrage. But that is not the only issue, far from it. So you get a diversity of views and goals. And a perfect example of this is Margaret Sanger, who I think most people know is a proponent of birth control. She's also a proponent of eugenics. So she sees birth control as two things. It is middle-class women's empowerment. Middle-class women can control whether they get pregnant or not, but it's also a form of racial purification because the state should be encouraging the lesser types to breed less. At the same time, someone like Charlotte Perkins Gilman is saying things that, well, probably wouldn't sound very out of date with feminism today. We find maleness in the absurdist extremes in war, through every form of glorious ostentation with the loudest possible accompaniment of noise. I quite like that. It sounds like masculinity always has a marching band with it. And so you do get things like the Feminist Alliance. But as you can see here, what the Feminist Alliance is talking about is not the vote. It's talking about a lot of other things. The flip side of that is Ines Milholland. Women are the mothers of the race, and admittedly more concerned than anyone else with all that goes to protect life. No one, not least of all the advanced feminist thinkers, questions the imperative beauty and the value of romantic, by which she means largely non-sexual love. Indeed, the hope is that marriage, far from being undermined or destroyed, can be made real and lasting. This is a different kind of feminism. It's a different kind of women's movement. So while they do look to the suffragettes of England, so you see they look at the radical suffragism. You do have hunger strikers, people chaining themselves to the White House fences. That sort of thing is going on. The same as you're getting in England. I don't think pillar boxes blow up. But anyway, on the 18th of August, 1920, Tennessee approves the 19th Amendment, which grants women suffrage. The year before, Prohibition Amendment had been ratified. So you kind of see the two great women's movements of the period, suffrage and temperance, have both won. Suffrage doesn't win first, prohibition does. And I think that's really an interesting insight and a reminder of how rural America is. So we see a lovely image of Alice Paul. Emma Goldman talking about motherhood being the highest fulfillment of a woman's nature. Motherhood is the highest process. This sort of naivete that to a certain extent pushes a lot of what would be seen as a radical women's agenda at the time. Giving women the vote is radical, is doing it for slightly odd reasons. The reality is that women got the vote and that they did not vote as a gendered bloc. They voted like their husbands and their fathers voted, along class and religious lines. In other words, giving women the vote really didn't change a great deal. It just meant there were more people eligible to vote. But prohibition comes in, suffrage comes in, the 1920s is different. Women now have the vote. This is a decade of possibility. It's also a decade where the vast majority of the population, particularly in urban areas, is committing crime by continuing to engage in the selling and buying of alcohol. And some of the women involved in the suffrage movement actually say, look, what happened is we got what we wanted and then we didn't quite know what to do. Now, some of the suffragettes reform into the League of Women's Voters. And what they're trying to do is to create a gendered voting bloc, pushing for social reform, anti-discrimination, for education. It's never really successful because, as I said, women tend not to vote as a gendered bloc. But they're the ones that kind of identify the next great cause. Pacifism, the response to the First World War, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which is regularly introduced in Congress from 1923 onwards and has still not been ratified. So what do you get by the 1920s? Well, more women are going to universities and marriage age is being delayed by urban middle-class women. This is not the experience of rural or working class or African American women. There is an illusion of prosperity and gradualism. The 1920s there's a lot of money sloshing about and there's a lot of opportunity. And things do change for women. Their clothing changes. They're able to drive. They are wearing makeup. They're cutting their hair shorter. And an awful lot about the lives of women becomes slightly less complicated. If you're middle class, this doesn't necessarily apply to working class or rural women. They're not all out there chopping their hair off and wearing, short skirts. In fact, my great grandmother, to the day she died in the middle of the 1980s, had never ever cut her hair. But there are limited gains, but they are limited. So people are getting a 12-hour day, not a 16-hour day. They're getting the right to sit at work. I'm not sure we would see this as being that much better, though I guess 16 is worse than 12, but 12, a hard day. Now, there are a whole new breed of women appearing. People like Amelia Earhart, getting to the imagination of the country. Mary Pickford, along with Charlie Chaplin, is setting up things like United Artists and is making a fortune. Actresses like Clara Bow and Theda Bara, and in particular, Marlene Dietrich, who is famous, as you see in this picture, for being a cross-dresser. Now, we don't look at that picture and we're not stunned by it. In the 1920s, that was a shocking photograph. She was in drag. But what she's saying is, hey, women can wear trousers. Apparently they can wear top hats as well, and they can smoke. This is Theda Bara, and this gives you an idea of what movies were like before the Hays Code came in. Movies in the 1920s were very different from the movies that came out in the 30s and afterwards. They were extremely risque, very sexualized, lots of cross-dressing, lots of appearances of gay characters, women in very dominant roles. So that period of the 1920s and silent films is very, very interesting. By the 1930s, the main movement that you are seeing amongst educated middle-class women is pacifism. So people like Jane Addams and Nicholas Butler are getting the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931 for their efforts to promote pacifism. But I think we all know that pacifism is about to run smack into the face of fascism, as well as communism in the Soviet Union. There is, interestingly, and probably not mentioned enough, the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching in the 1930s. This is a multiracial movement, and it is church-based, and it is the precursor of what we sort of see with the church-based movement in the 50s with people like Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, the New Deal programs are coming in, and they are changing things in that they are putting people to work, but they're putting people to work in the midst of a depression. So it's in this period that you start to see someone like Eleanor Roosevelt being held up as a model of wife, mother, political supporter. She comments that women had an understanding heart, but men had ability brains. This same sort of naive, rather weird attitude about what women were supposed to be doing in wider society. She had refused to divorce FDR, despite his affairs, primarily because she wanted to protect his political career and she did not believe in divorce. Women do play a part in Roosevelt's administrations. Mary Tewson is head of the Women's Division of the Democratic Party. Frances Perkin becomes the first woman cabinet minister, Secretary of Labor. Ellen Woodward, the WPA, which supports Project Administration, which built lots of schools and things like that during the Depression across the country. And in particular, Mary McLeod Bethune, who becomes director of the Negro Affairs, and she is a proponent inside the administration for ensuring that African Americans get a fair deal out of the New Deal. But it's the Depression. The federal government passes a rule that only one member of a family can work in the civil service. That means women lose their jobs. Wives lose their jobs. There are moves to prohibit women from working in 20 state legislatures. To be fair, it only passes in Louisiana. And what you find is, if you look at say the 1930s and particularly the 1940s census, is that women are being pushed back into domestic service, clerical and garment making, and marital security. So the movements that exist at the time, the AFL, the CIO, are promoting labor rights and better working conditions, but they are very male dominated and they are very white dominated. They are quite happy to support differential pay for women and African Americans. They're quite happy to support the closing of certain professions and certain roles to women and non-white people. There are strikes during the Depression. The Memorial Day Massacre in Chicago, when steelworkers are fired upon by the police. Flint, Michigan, during automobile workers' strikes, women are going around armed with clubs and blackjack cautious. But when we say on the eve of war, what has been accomplished? Well, there are things that have been accomplished, but they are mostly legal changes, like suffrage. The professions are still very segregated, both along lines of race and gender. Pay differentials on the basis of race and gender are extreme and totally legally allowed and recognized. Most women continue to marry and had children. In other words, most continue to focus on hope-making and domestic science, as it's called. There was war work in the First World War. There is war work in the Second World War. These provide temporary gains, but the reality is the post-war prosperity, whether it's the 1920s or the 1950s, tends to undercut wartime radicalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. That was very, very fascinating. I think we've kind of briefly said in the chat, but I feel like here there's also a lot of exposure to the lives of women in the UK at that time period, but I really don't know very much about the lives of women in other parts of the world. So it was very interesting to get an insight into what was happening in the US. And we already have a question, so I will just go straight into that. From Morag, who's saying, like, I wonder if the women who immigrated to Canada were in a similar situation to women of the US in this time period, or was it different due to Canada's links with the UK?
So I think the reality is that there's going to be enormous similarities, not least because the majority of women in Canada and the US are going to be in rural environments. They're going to be working in farms. They're going to be in quite isolated communities. So I don't think there's going to be that much of a difference. You are right that race is less of an issue, and it's less of a legal issue in Canada. But even in Canada, as well as in the UK, it is perfectly acceptable to pay women less for doing the same job when they are allowed to do the same job. Lots of cases there aren't. Yes. um, yes, the temperance is
Is it
driven
okay if I
by
just quickly
yeah,
read
yeah,
this,
yeah,
just in case people aren't paying attention, or not paying attention, but they're not,
yeah.
maybe don't have the chat open. So just the question is, the temperance radicalism in rural areas that you mentioned would be driven by religious, e.g. Methodist beliefs, or because the partaking of alcohol was associated with violence in general, as well as violence against women? To what extent do these historical temperance movements in the US mirror the contemporary approach to temperance? And a big thank you there for this fascinating trip through American women's history.
I think the temperance movement is really interesting because yes, you're right. It is Methodist, it's Baptist, but the temperance movement is fundamentally concerned with liquor, with hard spirits. And immigration kind of complicates this because with the arrival of Italians and Germans in large numbers, and quite often into Germans into rural areas, you have the arrival of beer drinking and wine consumption. And that's new. So there's a lot of pushback from these groups against this sort of temperance because the temperance movement says alcohol, beer, wine, it's all the same to us. And these groups are going, but wait a minute, there's a big difference between having a beer or a glass of wine with dinner and going into the saloon and spending your whole pay packet on whiskey. And they're right, there is a big difference. So there is a real tension, quite often, even in rural areas, because the temperance movement is coming out of a particular type of American experience, particularly of the West and rural areas, which is an opposition to saloons and hard liquor. And it gets complicated when you have these immigrants who are overwhelmingly Catholic, who come into these very Protestant areas with a different attitude towards drink and also a different type of drink. Beer was not that common until the Germans arrived, and wine very uncommon.
Thank you. Just a reminder that if anyone does have any questions, you can just put them in the chat, and we still have plenty of time for questions. If not, I can kind of roll with some of my own. I was going to ask, oh, well, Nicole's popped one in. So I was wondering if the same outrage to the triangle skirt waste factory fire happened when the treatment of the radium girls came to light.
Um, I mean, there was a lot of reaction to it. It wasn't as great because it wasn't in a sort of profession that involved so many people. It was also not quite as instantaneously memorable. You didn't have the coffins lined up the way you did with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So I think the sort of experience of it was slightly different. The outrage was different. And bear in mind the outrage was also partially, well, most of the women who died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were immigrants. So a lot of that 80,000 response is, yes, it's women angry, but it's also immigrant women angry. And I think there's a, we call it intersectionality, but what it just means is there's a lot of things that complicate this discussion, and it's hard to tease out the sort of women's movement aspect from race and class and ethnicity. They're all playing into this.
Do you feel like because there's like I feel like when you're talking, it to me feels like there's just even so much, there are so many more layers to the story within America than there is in the UK. Do you feel that that's like a fair common, or do you think that there were a similar level of like depths of complexities? You know, I'm just thinking like I know there was immigration in the UK, but America is kind of like the home of the land of kind of
Yeah,
immigrants,
yeah.
and like there's so much
No,
more like
yeah.
diversity.
I think you're right. I mean, first of all, Britain, by the time you get to the late 19th century, is incredibly urbanized in a way that America isn't. America, you don't get a majority of the people living in what we might consider to be urban town city environments until really the Second World War. So, and for a very long time, well into the 70s and 80s, the average American grew up in a town of 10,000. You wouldn't have it'd be a long time since you'd be able to say that of someone in Britain. So yes, class, in other words, the workers versus the not workers is an issue in Britain that feeds into this. But the ethnicity element is not as great unless you're talking about Irish, because most of the immigration into Britain is Irish. And of course, there you get a religious element as well, because they are Irish Catholics. So religion sort of complicates that. But the identifying of class, I think, is a lot stronger of an issue in Britain than it is in the States. And largely that, I think, is because less of the population is industrialized.
Thank you. We have our next question as well from Richard. I was wondering if women were called to work during World War II in the States as they were in the UK, and if yes, did this shape their work expectations post 1945?
Yeah, just as in the First World War, bear in mind the American experience in the First World War is very short-lived. World War II, you do get mass mobilization in the US. It is later than in Britain by about 2 years. Nevertheless, women are being pulled into all kinds of professions they hadn't done before. Quite, manual labor, things like Rosie the Riveter, that sort of stuff is indeed happening. And in the States, it is also an enormous period of opportunity for African Americans who are not being drafted because the US military is still largely white. And it's not till you sort of into the war a little bit later where you're starting to get Black Americans doing other things in the military. They are largely kept out of frontline combat units, but even then, they are beginning to be a part of the war. But until that happens, what they are doing is filling factory jobs, and so are women. So yes, it does produce expectations, and the sort of post-war, these jobs are now for returning soldiers, does have an impact. It creates a level of unemployment amongst women and African Americans, which triggers a sort of response. Now, for many of the women, they tend to fall back into marital security. For African Americans, there is a memory of the war period as being a period of great opportunity and wealth.
Thank you. I was going to ask as well, like what is the experience, and are there any kind of groups that are representative of like the Indigenous communities and like Native American women during this period?
Um, well, it's pretty horrific to talk about the experience of Indigenous peoples, really until you get into the 1970s in the US. They are largely on reservations. Um, it's into the middle of the 20th century before effectively you get the sense in which someone born on a reservation is a native born American, for example. Um, so they can have trouble finding employment because they effectively are illegal immigrants. They don't have papers, that sort of thing. Um, you do get quite, famous things like the Navajo talkers during the Pacific War and stuff like that. But the reality is the experience of many Indigenous peoples is the experience of the reservation and abject poverty, just abject poverty.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any? And
Yes,
Rebecca's mentioned
definitely.
industrial schools
Yes,
as
truly
well.
horrific, truly horrific. And that was going on in Canada as well.
Hmm. I'm just pausing just in case there was any other questions that are gonna um, come into the chat, or just to kind of go back a little bit. Obviously, like we kind of touched on the experience in for women post World War II, and obviously the experience in the US during World War One, as you mentioned, was like a little bit different. But what was the kind of impact of World War One, like specifically, and did it even present a little bit of an opportunity for women to get more involved in the workplace, or was it much more kind of life kind of goes on in a very similar way, other than the greater impact of war in the
Yeah,
background?
I mean, the experience of American women during the First World War is very different from the experience of women in the rest of the world fighting the First World War, because they are so late coming to the war. And although you do get a lot of mobilization, it is not sustained mass mobilization. Uh, oh, that's a good question. Um, were women attracted to employment more because of feminist activism or necessity? Not necessity. I mean, the reality is that well, so it's complicated. In urban areas, the vast majority of women who are working are doing so in industrial situations or piecework, that sort of thing. In the rural area, women are working. They are working on the farms. I remember having a wonderful conversation where my great aunt was with my grandmother and her husband and my grandfather, and they were talking about the good old days of, say, the 1920s and the 1930s. And my great aunt looked at me and said, "I hate old men." She said, "They don't remember washing diapers. They don't remember making bread. They don't remember getting a stove going. Their experience of that period was different." And she's absolutely right. It's wrong to think of women at home as not working. What they are doing is backbreaking work, particularly on the farms. And their experience is very, very different from the men out there with the horses. And isn't it wonderful out in the country, out in the fresh air and all of that stuff. She said that the past was an awful place and she liked microwaves.
Which is totally fair. It, I think many people who joined us regularly, I had my son last year, and it does always make me think women who were having toddlers, who were pregnant again, who were doing like heavy manual labor, who were not
Yes.
sleeping. It's like unimaginable. It's
Well,
unimaginable. Like
that same
a lot of
woman that
respect.
my great aunt Hattie had 12 live births. One was a set of twins and two miscarriages.
Yeah.
So she was pregnant 14 times. And that is the experience of women. So for many women, work was an escape, particularly single women and delayed marriage, avoiding marriage. I don't think we quite grasp how horrific it was for women before contraception. They didn't just have pregnancy literally till their bodies gave out, but every pregnancy was an opportunity to bleed out during birth. And that is the experience of women. If you look at literature particularly by women in the 1700s and the 1800s, they don't when someone says they're pregnant, there isn't everyone going, "Oh, yippee, let's have a gender reveal party." They're all like, "Oh dear God, let's hope you live."
Yeah.
So I think it's easy to talk about movements and focus on things like suffrage and stuff like that without really and totally overlook the experience of most women, which is to face the horrors of birth. And that really doesn't change until the pill.
Yeah. And you think as well, like you say, it's the birth where there's no pain medication, there's
Oh, yeah.
potentially no support from any professional or midwife or anything. You could
Yeah.
be in a house isolated in the middle of nowhere with
Yeah.
your 5-year-old, your 4-year-old, your 3-year-old, your
Yes.
2-year-old in the same room as you. And
you're washing out diapers by hand.
yeah, and you give birth and the next day you still have like all these children
Yes,
to take care of,
exactly.
and
Exactly.
the extremes of the environment surrounding you. And
Yeah. So I think work, particularly for single women, must have felt incredibly fulfilling and incredibly liberating to have their own money. And bear in mind that, it's not until the 60s that women in America can have their own bank accounts. It's really not until the 70s that women are able to get mortgages. Through most of the period I've just been talking about, women have no legal identity. It's really suffrage that kind of changes that. During the 19th century, the Supreme Court had ruled that women were indeed citizens, but that the right to vote was not an inherent right of citizenship. And in court, you couldn't sue a woman because a woman wasn't a full human being in law.
I just had another question
Ah.
from Richard. I was thinking about the press. How much did the press shape public opinion on working women?
Well, the press, I think, through a lot of the period is, well, so there is the virago woman that is sort of presented, but I think the idea of a particularly a hardworking typist is presented quite positively. Working class women making shirts is not particularly positive because they tend to be socialist and anarchist. So the press doesn't like them. But the press does rather like the prim woman who sits there and types and does that sort of work. That is decent middle class work. And so the press is positive about that. Movies, particularly in the 20s, tend to portray women as very, very positive, very independent, knowing their own mind, knowing their own bodies. It's quite sexualized, yes, but sexualized in a way where women are not sort of, just standing in the corner screaming sort of stuff. And that does tend to change with the Hays Code coming in.
Thank you. And what are like literacy rates like during this time period, and how much, I don't know, like how much importance is placed on like the education of girls throughout this time period?
Well, as I showed in the talk, there quite a lot of the organizations did prioritize education, particularly among immigrant women. Most native white women would have received basic education because basic education was a legal requirement. Now, it tended to not do too well amongst immigrant communities, densely packed in sort of slum areas of the cities. So there was a lot of these groups were talking about going into those areas and providing education. African American women, very minimal education, but that would be true of many African American men, particularly in the segregated South. Very, very minimal education.
We've just been having some lovely comments. Just thanking you for another fascinating talk. There's still like a little bit of time for questions if anyone else has anything that they want to ask. Malcolm's just said, were trade unions generally helpful for female rights?
Yes, in the sense of for health and safety issues, but in general, no. So trade unions worked very hard to close all kinds of roles to women and to African Americans. They staunchly supported differential pay rates for women and people of color. So yes, in the sense that they argued for better working conditions, safer working conditions, yes, they were helpful. But if you're talking about equality, absolutely not. Trade unions in America were unbelievably bigoted.
Thanks. And yeah, we just had a couple more comments saying
Oh,
thank
I
you,
know.
thank you, thank you. Yeah, like if there aren't any more questions, I'm just as we're getting lots of lovely thank you comments, that might be a nice point to wrap up. Yeah, I think we can kind of conclude it there. Yes, thank you very, very much to
Sure.
Bill for joining us again. As Nicole and I always say, we love working with Bill. We're very happy that he was happy to be our team's guinea pig
Yeah,
and do our
very
first
happy.
event back with us.
I think it worked all right.
Yeah, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us. It's great to see some familiar names and some new names as well. And we have another event happening in December, kind of festive theme and ghosts and the connection to Christmas and literature. So we hope that we'll see you there, and then we'll have a new program launching in the new year sometime. So yeah, thank you very, very much. We'll hopefully see you again soon, and enjoy the rest of your evenings or afternoons or mornings, wherever you're joining us from. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.